لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. So tonight's class, briefly before Salat al-Isha and hopefully before Salat al-Tarawih, we'll continue reading from Kitab Siyam, the chapter of fasting, from Mishkat al-Masabih. Mishkat al-Masabih. As we said last week, I would try to show some of the brothers and sisters a few versions of the translation if you already don't have the translation, if you don't already have the translation. So the first version, and Allahu Alam, I'm not sure, this may be the oldest one, I'm not sure, but it's a possibility this is the oldest translation, is Mishkat al-Masabih, English translation with explanatory notes by Dr. James Robson, a non-Muslim, and if I'm not mistaken, a Scottish Orientalist. Like many other Orientalists, they had a great deal of interest and concern for Islamic heritage and books of Islam in general, with a special focus on the books of Hadith. And there lies no doubt that wasn't an accident. And when we want to go too far off track, too far off, just a little bit, not too far off, is that these people, unfortunately, when it came to conquering and controlling and suppressing, they were very wise. And they were extremely strategic and tactical. They knew what to do and how to do it. And they knew that if they wanted to keep the Muslims at a lower state, a docile, submissive state, they knew where to strike them at. And of course, the Quran, identity, language, clothing, politics, etc., etc. But they knew the jugular vein was the Sunnah. We strip them of the Sunnah, we take away the Hadith, then the Quran is open for anyone's interpretation. And the Muslims have been doing this thing for 800 years, 1,000 years, and we can come and say that's not actually literal, that's just, Allah doesn't want you to do that. He just says do it with your hearts. Or you don't actually have to physically fight, just fight with your hearts, etc. So without the Hadith, they wanted to take the Quran and isolate it and leave it open for the interpretation for themselves, firstly, and for anyone else that was astray. So they knew this, and this is why they had a special interest in the books of Hadith. And that's why many of them learned the Arabic language, and that's why many of them did different services, not for the Muslims, but for their own research department on a find fault, criticize, try to find contradiction, etc. in the Hadiths. So this is one of the reasons why they studied those books and why many of those books were translated. And the same applies to different dictionaries. Famous dictionary people use, Hanswehr. Okay, and there are many other dictionaries as well by non-Muslims for their own research. Don't think they did it to help out the Muslims, even though the Muslims use the books today. They did it to help out themselves to further their own goals. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that their translations were bad or poor. Some of their translations were better than some Muslim translations, and that's a fact. And we all know that, as it states in the narration, the prophetic narration, that Allah could support the religion through a wicked man. Allah could support the religion through a wicked man. So there are different things that non-Muslims have done that have helped out Islam and the Muslims. And that's nothing strange. Abu Talib, Prophet's uncle, was a non-Muslim. And Allah used him to support and to protect Islam and the Muslims. So therefore, this is one translation. It's in 2 volumes. This book is actually here. It's in the Imam's office, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe I am. I think I saw it one night. What's important is, this is, no doubt, I consider it to be a very good translation. And I've used it and depended upon it several times. And Allah knows best. Then we have another one, Mishkat al-Masabih, with Arabic text, volume 2. And it's translated by and annotated by Abdul Hamid Siddiqui. Abdul Hamid Siddiqui, alhamdulillah, has other translations of books of Hadith as well. And of course, him being a Muslim and having a background in education in Islam and Hadith literature is definitely a plus. But it doesn't mean just because a person is a Muslim or even a scholar of Islam that his translation is more accurate. That's the discussion. It could be a non-Muslim who may have a better translation, better command of the English language, the fluidity of the translation, etc. And unfortunately, and I'm not saying this about this version, but I'm talking about in general, there's some Muslims who translate certain books for their own goals and their own ideologies and schools of thought. And they may translate a text with some biasness or some partisan practices because of what type of Islam or madhab or practice that they have. And you may find a non-Muslim who's free from all of that. I'm not Shi'i, Sunni, Hanafi, Batini, Ismaili. I'm none of that. I'm just presenting an academic translation. Let the Muslims fight over who's right. Shiite, Sunni, Ali, Uthman. You guys can do that. I'm translating the book. And oftentimes, unfortunately, some Muslims, they'll translate certain things and they'll have a bias translation to it, or they'll add footnotes and they put their own twist and interpretation on it. That's a known fact. Not among all, but some. And Allah knows best. Some very interesting footnotes in this book. As I said, it was annotated, and it's not just a translation as well. Fiqh notes, explanatory notes of different scholars of the past. This is an excellent work right here. And of course, perfection is for Allah, but it's an excellent work. Last but not least, 2. This one is in 4 volumes, and it says Mishkat al-Masabih, the niche of lamps. The niche of lamps. English, Arabic, by Muhammad bin Abdullah al-Khatib al-Tabrizi, the original author, and it's translated by Dr. Muhammad Mahdi al-Sharif. Muhammad Mahdi al-Sharif. This is in 4 volumes, and this is the latest of the translations that I've come across. And I think there's a 4th, and maybe even more. We saw one online last week by another translator. And alhamdulillah, I haven't had the chance to really study and really dig into this translation and how accurate it is. But from that which I've seen, it's good as well. And of course, if you're a book collector, if you're a connoisseur, if you have an Islamic library, it's not going to hurt you to get all 3. All 3.
I have a 4th one called Fazlul Kareem, 4 volumes, Mishkat.
Perfect. Inshallah, you show us.
Yeah.
Business that. Yeah, that way we can get it as well. Jazakallah khairan. All right, so we're in Kitab Siyam, and obviously we don't have that much time. I'm not going to take up too much time. Well, last week we read the Al-Fasl al-Awwal, the first section, and we said that the book is divided into 3 sections. The first section are the hadiths that he considers to be sihah, that are in Bukhari and Muslim. And the second section, Al-Hisan, the hadiths that are in Sunan Ibn Majah, Tirmidhi, Abu Dawud, etc., which are fair hadiths, acceptable, sound, but not the top grade A. And the third, Al-Fasl al-Thani, was the hadith which are famous and popular, Ad-Di'af, a hadith that have some weakness in them, and of course there's benefit in reading and mentioning them as well. All right, so the first chapter is considered to be the virtue of fasting, the superiority and the excellence of fasting. Then the next chapter he says, Babu Ru'yatil Hilal, sighting the moon or seeing the moon, looking for the moon. Al-Fasl al-Awwal an Ibn Umar قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا تصوموا حتى تروا الهلال ولا تفطروا حتى تروه فإن غم عليكم فاقدروا له وفي رواية قال الشهر 29 ليلة فلا تصوموا حتى تروه فإن غم عليكم فأكملوا العدة 30 متفق عليه. First hadith is reported by Ibn Umar, and of course we've already started fasting, but it's a benefit for past and for future. Ibn Umar narrates that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, do not fast until you see the crescent moon. Do not fast until you see the new moon phase, the new moon birth, the crescent. And do not break your fast, do not stop Ramadan until you see it as well. فَإِنْ غُمَّ عَلَيْكُمْ, if it's cloudy, if it's inclement weather, you cannot see the new moon phase or cycle, then estimate it. Make an estimation. And there's another version that says, الشهر 29 ليلة, that the month is 29 days or 29 nights, meaning the lunar month. The lunar month, there is no leap year, there's no such thing as a 28-day month, nor is there a 31-day month. The month will either be 29 or 30 according to the lunar calendar. The lunar calendar. So this narration says that the month is 29 nights. Don't fast until you see it. And if it's cloudy, then complete 30 nights or 30 days. And this hadith is collected by Imam al-Bukhari and collected by Imam Muslim. Muttafaqun alayhi, agreed upon. The main lesson from this hadith is the proper way of commencing and finishing the month of Ramadan. It's the main lesson. The Islamic way of commencing the fast and finishing the fast. Clear. Some issues that pertain to this hadith, of course, local versus international. Should we take the moon sighting from Turkey or South Africa or Saudi Arabia or Pakistan or Peru or Argentina or Hawaii? Or should we base our fasting off of what we see in Philadelphia? All right, so there's local versus international. Those who go with the international sighting, they have different proofs and evidences. They say, number one, is only one moon. There aren't two moons. There is no a moon here and a moon there. It's only one moon, one sun, one moon. Secondly, some people, they make the argument that these different countries, Turkey, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, these different countries in the Middle East and the Far East, etc., they have been looking for the moon for years. Their culture is based off of the moon. They've been looking for the moon, searching for the moon before Islam came to this country. They have expertise in looking for the moon. They have systems, they have courts, they have qadis. They have a Islamic body, not just a group of brothers from the masjid that actually establish the moon being sighted or not. So it only makes sense for us to go with the international sighting. And then those who say the opposite, they say we should go with the local sighting. When Turkey is fasting, we're eating. When Saudi Arabia is making Maghrib, it's not Maghrib here. They have a time zone, we have a time zone. They have a hemisphere, we have a hemisphere. They live in a different lane, a different part of the world. How can we rely upon their sighting and neglect the sun and the moon in our own region? They say this. Also, they say is that the month of Ramadan is a pillar of Islam. And it is a responsibility. And this responsibility is not to be delegated to the blind following of men. Rather, it's an obligation upon the community for the men and women, the brothers and sisters, to look for the moon themselves and to establish Islam and the practice of the pillars of Islam themselves. Thirdly, they say that looking for the moon is not rocket science. It's not something which is complex physics or geometry or trigonometry, something which is so mind-boggling. It takes a skill, it takes some basic knowledge, but it isn't rocket science. And it can be done, and therefore we should do it ourselves. So therefore, the people, they have different views, they have different opinions with regards to local versus international. And these are the main arguments that they're going to make for it or against it. And of course, there are further details, which brings us to the second issue, and that is, can we use the calculation? Can we use the calendar? Can we depend upon science and technology? Can we depend upon the solar calendar, the Gregorian calendar for the commencement of the month of Ramadan and for the birth of the new moon phase or not? Obviously, some, if not most, are going to say no. It's impermissible. The Prophet ﷺ said, La tasumu, do not fast, hatta tarawhu, until you see it. And then say hisab, calculation, falak, stars, nautical. He didn't mention any of these things. He says the actual eye. And they say the argument that they make is that there's a wisdom in the people organically looking for the moon, instead of them depending upon a calendar with regards to being happy of the month of Ramadan, the glad tidings, making the effort, versus, oh, it's going to be on this day. It's going to be on that day. Prepare for this day. And people sitting back and taking that relaxed position of a calendar. Okay? And then those that counter this argument by saying, we use the calendar and we use calculation for everything else. We use it for our direction, our global positioning satellite or system, GPS. We use it for birthdays. My son is 13. Why is the son 13? Is he 13 in Sha'ban? Is he 13 in Ramadan? Is he 13 in Rajab? Or is he 13 in February, in March? So they say it's hypocrisy now. We use the calendar for everything else. Getting paid, retirement, everything is based off of the mushrik calendar. And the ease and the scientific developments of the calendar, why can't we use it for the month of Ramadan? Secondly, they argue and they say that looking for the moon is a major means of division and separation among the Muslims. They'll say they saw the moon. No, we didn't see it in Hawaii. I don't care about Saudi Arabia. They're corrupt. I'm not listening to what they say. We're going to look for it. And the next thing you know, there are 3 different Eids on 3 different days in one city. Instead of everyone saying it's going to be on the 15th of April. Done. Khalas. Let's not argue anymore. So that's an argument with regards to those who say that depending upon the calculation is haram, impermissible and invalid. And then there are those who may say it's not necessarily haram, but it's not the organic way of doing it, the sunnah way. And then there are those who hold the view that we should use the calendar because we use the calendar for everything else. We're living in 2021, etc. And they make an argument regarding this hadith. And they say that the Prophet ﷺ said, Sumu li ru'yati, fast when you see it. La tasumu hatta tarahu. Don't fast until you see it. Some may argue, may say, is that the Prophet ﷺ, he used the terminology that was known to them. And that was, they looked for the moon. And the Arabs of the time of the Prophet ﷺ were predominantly illiterate. Writing and reading wasn't from their strong points. If a man could read, if he could write, if he could ride a horse, if he could swing a sword, if he could shoot a bow, and if he knew poetry, he was considered to be a perfect man. He was complete if he had all of those skills. The average person did not read and write. And we know that Islam and the Quran and the revelation of the Quran and Sunnah was a major key factor in abolishing illiteracy in Arabia. And it did great wonders for their culture and for their language. And before that, reading and writing wasn't a big concern to them. They memorized things. Okay, they memorized things. So some people may say that the Prophet ﷺ, he said, look for the moon because that is how they calculated it. They looked for it with the eye. And it doesn't mean that you can't use other means of establishing it. Whereas the hadith clearly says, estimate, measure, if you can't see it. Another argument that's made is people say, well, those who look for the moon, they also use the calendar as well. And they have assistance from the calendar. All right, and there's a long discussion. People claiming to have spotted the moon in a time in which the scientists say is impossible for the moon to be seen in this part of the earth. And of course, two just Muslims, two righteous Muslims, they go to the court and they swear by Allah. They say, we saw the crescent. So we did declare them to be liars, or we declare them to be mistaken, and they're just brothers that you know. Righteous brothers say, look, I saw it. There's no doubt, me and Fulan, we saw the moon. So that's a very long argument with regards to Islam, Sunnah, science, with regards to the Muslims not having no centralized leadership, and the Muslims fighting and having schisms in different denominations, etc. What's important is that the original way is that the moon should be looked for with the eyes. And of course, last but not least, they say that the people who look for the moon aren't using their eyes. Rather, they're using technology. They're using telescopes. They're using electrical telescopes. Telescopes that are high-powered, and which is a great deal of magnification. So in reality, you're not following the direct command by looking at it with the eye. And then some say it's still with the eye. You get the point. Next hadith. The author, he says, وعن أبي هريرة رضي الله عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم صوموا لرؤيته وافطروا لرؤيته فإن غم عليكم فأكملوا عدة شعبان 30 متفق عليه. وعن ابن عمر قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إن أمة أمية لا نكتب ولا نحسب الشهر هكذا وهكذا وهكذا وعقد الإبهام في الثالثة ثم قال الشهر هكذا وهكذا وهكذا يعني تمام 30 يعني مرة 29 ومرة 30 متفق عليه. وعن أبي بكرة قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم شهر عيد لا ينقصان رمضان وذو الحجة متفق عليه. The next three narrations, one is reported